I'm Lillian, 34, and I always believed family meant acceptance and love. After 5 years of marriage to James, I was excited to host our first Christmas in our new home with his family. Despite my efforts, I always felt like an outsider looking in. I never imagined that a simple gift exchange would become the turning point that would change everything. Before I continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt excluded by family. Growing up in a middle-class family in Minnesota, Christmas was always special in our home. My parents weren't wealthy, but they made sure the holidays were filled with love and warmth. We had simple traditions. Mum's cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning, Dad reading The Night Before Christmas on Christmas Eve, and homemade gifts that meant more than anything money could buy. When presents were exchanged, it was the thought behind them that mattered most. I met James at the marketing firm where we both worked. I was creating copy for advertisements, and he was in the finance department. Our first encounter happened in the break room when I accidentally knocked over his coffee. Instead of being upset, he laughed and asked if I'd join him for a replacement cup after work. That cup of coffee turned into dinner, which turned into a whirlwind romance. Within a year, we were engaged, and I thought I had found my happily ever after. James came from a different world. His family had old money, the kind that had been passed down for generations. The Harrisons were well known in our city's social circles. They had traditions that stretched back decades, and social standing was paramount to them. I knew marrying into this family would be an adjustment, but I was in love and believed love could conquer all differences. Margaret Harrison, my mother-in-law, was the matriarch in every sense of the word. Tall, elegant, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a posture that commanded respect, she ran the family with an iron fist in a velvet glove. From our first meeting, I sensed her disapproval. It was never anything overt, just the slight narrowing of her eyes when James introduced me the way she said, "Oh, how interesting," when she learned about my career in advertising and how she would casually mention the suitable women James had dated before me. William, my father-in-law, was Margaret's perfect counterpart. Where she was forceful, he was passive. He followed her lead in all things and rarely voiced his own opinions when she was present. However, when Margaret wasn't around, William would sometimes show me kindness, complimenting my cooking or asking genuine questions about my family. These moments gave me hope that I could eventually find my place among the Harrisons. James had 2 siblings who couldn't have been more different from each other. His sister Abigail was 3 years older than him, unmarried, and seemed to exist solely to win her mother's approval. She chaired the same charity committees as Margaret, dressed in a similar style, and even adopted her mother's mannerisms. Around me, she was coldly polite, always watching for mistakes she could subtly point out to James later. Then there was Thomas, the golden child. As the oldest and only son until James came along, he had followed perfectly in his father's footsteps, taking over the family investment firm, marrying Sophia from another prominent family, and producing 2 perfectly behaved children who attended the most prestigious private school in the city. Thomas wasn't unkind, but he barely acknowledged my existence beyond perfunctory greetings at family gatherings. Over the 5 years of our marriage, I had experienced countless small incidents that showed Margaret's dislike for me. She would taste my cooking and suggest it needed a little something, then completely remake the dish when I wasn't looking. When I mentioned a promotion at work, she would smile tightly and say, "How nice for you to have a little hobby." Once I overheard her asking James if he was certain I was right for him mentioning a family friend's daughter who had just returned from Europe and was asking about him. Despite these challenges, I was determined to win them over. I learnt the family recipes, memorizing Margaret's exact specifications for her famous cranberry sauce. I volunteered for every family event, helping with planning and setup. I studied the family history so I could understand the references they made, and I went out of my way to find thoughtful gifts that acknowledged their interests and preferences. Whenever I expressed my concerns to James about his mother's behaviour, he would squeeze my hand and assure me, "Mum just takes time to warm up to people." She was the same way with Sophia when Thomas first brought her home, but Sophia had come from a family with a similar background and social standing. I was an outsider in every way, and deep down, I knew Margaret had no intention of ever truly accepting me. When James and I finally bought our own home, a modest but charming colonial that stretched our budget to its limits, I saw an opportunity. Hosting Christmas would give me a chance to create new traditions that blended both our families' styles. Maybe in a space that was ours with everything done exactly right, Margaret would finally see that I was worthy of her son. I started planning in October. Our house would be a holiday wonderland with decorations that honoured the Harrison traditions while adding personal touches that represented our life together. I spent evenings after work scouring antique shops for ornaments that matched the vintage ones Margaret displayed each year. I ordered custom stockings with each family member's name embroidered in the same script as the ones that had hung in the Harrison home for generations. The menu was planned with military precision. I practiced Margaret's recipes until I could make them with my eyes closed, but also included a few dishes from my family that I thought would complement the Harrison standards. I ordered the specific brand of champagne that William favoured and made sure to find the exact English crackers that had been part of their table setting for as long as James could remember. The gifts were my primary focus. I spent months selecting the perfect present for each family member regardless of cost. For William, I found a first edition of his favourite author's most celebrated work. For Thomas and Sophia, I commissioned a hand-painted portrait of their children based on a photo taken during their summer vacation. Abigail would receive a vintage brooch from a designer she collected, which I found after weeks of searching online auctions. For the children, I selected educational toys from the exclusive shop Margaret always mentioned. And for Margaret herself, I had spent nearly a third of our gift budget on a cashmere shawl hand-woven by an artisan whose work was featured in her favourite luxury magazine. I had even contacted the artisan directly to incorporate subtle patterns that represented the Harrison family history, a small sailboat for their summer home in Newport, a delicate rendering of their family crest, and the flowers that had been in Margaret's wedding bouquet, information I had carefully gleaned from old photos and conversations. The financial strain was significant. James noticed the credit card bills and expressed concern, but I assured him that making this Christmas perfect was worth the investment in our family relationships. He didn't fully understand my need to impress his family, but he supported my efforts with the good-natured tolerance that had made me fall in love with him. 2 weeks before Christmas, Margaret called to check in on our preparations. What started as a conversation quickly turned into a takeover. "Lillian, dear," she said with that tone that always made me feel 2 inches tall, "the Harrison Christmas has always been done a certain way. Let me help you avoid any unfortunate mistakes." What followed was a complete reorganization of my carefully made plans. The menu wasn't quite right. We would need to add 3 more traditional dishes. The dining room arrangement I had planned wouldn't work. She would send over the proper seating chart. And my decorations, well, she would bring some proper ones from their attic to supplement what I had. The day before Christmas Eve, Margaret arrived with William and 2 staff members from their home. Within hours, my decorations had been rearranged or replaced. The handmade wreath on our door was swapped for an elaborate creation from her preferred florist. The vintage ornaments I had so carefully collected were concentrated on one side of the tree, while the front, the side visible from the entry, was adorned with ornaments she had brought from their home. As she directed her staff to rearrange our furniture to accommodate the proper flow of a Harrison gathering, I heard her murmur to William, "It's a lovely little house, considering what they could afford." Later, as I was checking the guest room where Abigail would stay, I overheard Margaret on the phone with her daughter. "Yes, it's quite modest, but we'll make do. Some people just don't understand our family traditions, but we'll show her how it's done properly." James was caught in the middle. He tried to support me, suggesting that some of my original plans be kept, but when Margaret fixed him with her disapproving stare and reminded him of how things have always been done, he would back down. "It's just easier this way," he whispered to me when we were alone. "Mom knows how to host these gatherings and it means so much to her." On Christmas Eve, I stayed up until 3 a.m. wrapping all the gifts. Each package was a work of art with custom paper, hand-tied ribbons, and small personalised ornaments attached to each bow. I arranged them under the tree according to Margaret's preferred system, organised by family unit, with the largest in the back and the smallest in front for visual appeal. As I placed the final gift, Margaret's shawl wrapped in silver paper with a hand-calligraphed tag, I allowed myself to hope that tomorrow would be the day I would finally be accepted as a true member of the Harrison family. The family arrived in waves on Christmas Day. Thomas, Sophia and their children came first, bringing armloads of professionally wrapped gifts and immediately commenting on the house. "It has such potential," Sophia said, looking around our living room with the same expression one might use when viewing a moderately interesting museum exhibit. Abigail arrived next, her gifts fewer but equally immaculate, each adorned with the signature wrapping from an exclusive department store. She ear-kissed my cheeks before immediately seeking out Margaret, who had taken up position in what was normally my reading chair, but had become her command post for directing the day's activities. William gave me a genuine hug and slipped a small package into my hands. "Just a little something," he whispered. "You're doing a wonderful job." That small kindness nearly brought tears to my eyes, and I tucked the package away to open later, when I could properly appreciate this rare moment of acceptance. As the house filled with Harrison relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends who were treated as relations, the tension beneath my skin grew. Every time someone commented on a decoration or dish with the preface, "Oh, Margaret, you've outdone yourself," I bit my tongue against the correction that wanted to escape. This was supposed to be our hosting debut, but it had become yet another Margaret Harrison production, with James and me relegated to supporting roles in our own home. The dining room table extended to its full length, with borrowed leaves from Margaret's home, gleamed with the family china she had insisted we use, instead of the set we had received as wedding gifts. The food was arranged precisely according to her specifications: the turkey at William's end, the ham at the position where James would sit at Margaret's insistence, rather than at the other head of the table, where the host would traditionally be, and the side dishes arranged in order of tradition, with the oldest family recipes taking precedence of place near the heads of the table. Margaret had also dictated the seating arrangement. I was placed halfway down the table between a distant cousin whose name I could never remember correctly and one of Thomas's children. James was seated near his father, far from me, where he could participate in the important family conversations. When I had suggested we might sit together, Margaret had laughed lightly and said, "Darling, married couples never sit together at formal dinners. It's simply not done." The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone in a stream. They discussed people I had never met, events that had occurred before I joined the family, and inside jokes that needed no explanation among them because they had been told so many times before. Whenever I attempted to join a discussion, there would be a slight pause, sometimes an indulgent smile, and then they would continue as if I hadn't spoken. "Do you remember that Christmas when James performed in the pageant?" Thomas's wife asked, launching the group into gales of laughter before the story even began. "He was the most adorable wise man," Margaret said, reaching over to pat James's hand affectionately. "He kept trying to give the baby Jesus his own teddy bear. Mum wouldn't let me take it back," James added, grinning. "Said it was dedicated to the Lord now, so I had to leave it at the church." "You cried for days," Abigail chimed in, "until Dad secretly bought you an identical one." William chuckled. "Not identical enough, apparently." He knew right away it wasn't the same bear. I sat quietly pushing food around my plate as they continued sharing memories I would never be part of. When I had first married James, I had hoped they would include me in these moments, perhaps explaining the context or asking about my own childhood traditions. But after 5 years, I had learned that the Harrisons' reminiscences weren't meant to include outsiders. They were reminders of their exclusivity, their shared history that no one else could claim. As the meal progressed, James became increasingly engrossed in family discussions, barely glancing in my direction. Thomas and his wife began discussing the vacation home they had just purchased in Aspen, making sure everyone knew the exact location and proximity to celebrities' homes. Abigail and Margaret put their heads together to plan the upcoming charity gala, pointedly ignoring my offer to help with the graphic design for the invitations. "Lillian, could you pass the cranberry sauce?" William asked during a lull in conversation. "This turkey is excellent, by the way. Did you use a special recipe?" Before I could answer, Margaret interjected, "It's my grandmother's recipe, of course. I made sure Lillian had all the proper instructions. Though I did have to adjust the seasoning a bit when I checked it this morning." She smiled at me with benevolent condescension. It just needed a woman's experienced touch. As dessert approached, I excused myself to retrieve the pies from the kitchen. As I stood in the relative quiet arranging the desserts on the serving trays Margaret had insisted we use, I heard voices from the dining room more clearly than the speakers probably intended. "She tries so hard, doesn't she?" That was Abigail's voice, pitched low but still carrying. Yes, bless her heart. Sophia with that particular southern inflection that made the phrase an insult rather than sympathy. "James could have done so much better," Margaret's voice not even attempting to be quiet. "Amanda Schuyler still asks about him, you know. Such a shame." "Mum, please," James's voice, but with no real force behind it. Just the token protest of someone going through the motions. I stood frozen, the pie server clutched in my hand as tears threatened to spill. Taking a deep breath, I composed myself and returned to the dining room with a smile fixed firmly on my face. No one noticed my slightly reddened eyes or the tremble in my hands as I served Margaret first as she had instructed was proper. After dinner, the family gathered in our living room, where the Christmas tree glittered with the ornaments that were now a mix of my carefully chosen pieces and Margaret's family heirlooms. The gift exchange was about to begin, and despite everything that had happened throughout the day, I felt a flutter of excitement. This was where my efforts would shine, in the thoughtful personal gifts I had selected for each family member. According to Harrison tradition, gift-giving followed a strict protocol. The oldest family member, Margaret of course, would select and distribute gifts one at a time, and everyone would watch as each person opened their present and expressed appropriate appreciation. This process would continue until all gifts had been opened, and it could take hours with a group this size. Margaret settled into the armchair positioned next to the tree, the spot I had originally planned for Santa's visit with the children later, but which she had claimed as her distribution point. She put on her reading glasses with theatrical slowness and picked up the first gift. "This one is for William from Thomas and Sophia," she announced, handing the large, perfectly wrapped package to her husband. Inside was an expensive-looking telescope, which William exclaimed over appreciatively. The process continued. Thomas received golf clubs from his parents, a cashmere sweater from Abigail, and an expensive watch from his wife. Sophia opened a jewelry box containing pearl earrings from Margaret and William, a spa gift certificate from Abigail, and a designer handbag from her husband. The children received an abundance of toys and clothes, exclaiming with well-trained politeness over each item. Abigail unwrapped a weekend getaway to a luxury spa from her parents, a silk scarf from Thomas and Sophia, and various smaller gifts from other relatives. James received a set of premium golf lessons from his parents, a rare bottle of scotch from Thomas, and an engraved money clip from Abigail. As the pile of gifts under the tree diminished, I noticed with growing unease that while James had received a gift from every family member, nothing had been handed to me. I glanced at the packages still waiting to be distributed, recognizing none of the wrapping paper patterns as those I had seen on gifts when the family arrived. The realization dawned slowly. Then all at once, there were no gifts for me. Not from Margaret and William, not from Thomas and Sophia, not from Abigail, not even from the cousins or family friends who had brought token gifts for everyone else. The only gift with my name on it was the small package William had slipped me earlier, which I had tucked into my pocket to open later. As Margaret caught my eye across the room, the corner of her mouth lifted in what could only be described as a smirk. Subtle enough that no one else would notice, but unmistakable to me. James was busy examining his new scotch, holding it up to the light, and discussing its rarity with Thomas. He hadn't noticed that I sat empty-handed while everyone around me had unwrapped multiple presents. When Margaret finally began distributing the gifts I had brought, starting with the custom portrait for Thomas and Sophia, I felt a flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. "Oh, how thoughtful," Sophia said, as she unwrapped the portrait, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Though the artist didn't quite capture Charlotte's features, did they? Thomas barely glanced at it. "We'll find a place for it somewhere," he said, setting it aside to return to his conversation with James. Abigail opened the vintage brooch I had searched months to find, examined it briefly, and said, "This looks quite similar to one I already have, but thank you for the thought." She placed it back in its box without pinning it on, unlike the scarf from Sophia, which she had immediately draped around her neck. William seemed genuinely pleased with the first edition book, running his fingers gently over the cover and thanking me with a warmth that was absent from the others' responses. But when he caught Margaret's sharp glance, he too set his gift aside more quickly than he had the others he'd received. When Margaret opened her gift, the hand-woven cashmere shawl with all its carefully incorporated personal details, she unfolded it with clinical detachment. "How unusual," she said, not even noticing the pattern elements I had specifically commissioned. "Not quite the style or quality I typically prefer, but I appreciate the effort, Lillian." James opened the vintage watch I had found for him, the same model his grandfather had worn in a family photo he particularly treasured. "Thanks, Lil," he said with a quick smile before turning back to Thomas to continue their conversation about golf courses they wanted to play in the coming year. When all the gifts had been distributed and opened, the stark reality was undeniable. I had given gifts to every member of the Harrison family and received nothing in return except the small package from William. As conversation continued around me, I sat in silence, the weight of the deliberate exclusion pressing on my chest like a physical force. "I suppose some people are new to family traditions," Margaret said to no one in particular, though her gaze flicked briefly in my direction. "The Harrisons have always exchanged gifts within the family, Blood relations and official spouses, of course. I had been James's official spouse for 5 years. James finally seemed to notice something was amiss. He looked around, a slight furrow appearing between his brows. "Mum, didn't you and Dad get something for Lillian?" He asked, his tone confused rather than confrontational. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "We just didn't know what you'd like, dear," she said to me, her tone falsely apologetic. "You're still so new to us, even after 5 years. It's difficult to know your tastes." "Mum, you could have asked me," James said, but his protest was weak, obligatory. "You're always so busy, darling," Margaret replied smoothly. "And Lillian has such unique preferences. We wouldn't want to get it wrong." Abigail and Thomas exchanged knowing looks, and I realized with stunning clarity that this had been planned. The entire family had coordinated to ensure I received no gifts, a pointed message about my place, or lack thereof, in the Harrison family. As everyone resumed their conversations, passing around cups of eggnog and plates of Christmas cookies, I sat motionless, processing what had just happened. No one seemed to notice or care about my humiliation. Even James had returned to his discussion with Thomas, the brief moment of recognition already forgotten. In the pocket of my dress, I could feel the small hard shape of William's gift, the only acknowledgement of my existence as a member of this family. I didn't dare open it now, not when the contrast between that small token and the abundance everyone else had received would only highlight my exclusion further. As I sat there surrounded by discarded wrapping paper and the happy chatter of a family that had just made it abundantly clear I didn't belong among them, something inside me shifted. Years of slights, subtle put-downs, and outright exclusion flickered through my mind like a slideshow of accumulated pain. I thought about all the times Margaret had corrected my attempts to participate in family traditions. I remembered Abigail's dismissive glances whenever I spoke at family gatherings. I recalled Thomas's habit of acting as if I were invisible unless directly forced to acknowledge me. And most painfully, I reflected on James's consistent failure to notice, much less stand up against his family's treatment of his wife. The memory of my mother's words from long ago surfaced, "Know when to speak up for yourself, Lillian. No one else will do it if you won't." Mum had faced her own challenges with my father's family, but unlike James, my father had stood firmly by her side, making it clear that disrespect toward his wife would not be tolerated. 5 years of trying to earn acceptance from people who had no intention of ever granting it. 5 years of diminishing myself, adjusting my behavior, spending beyond our means, all in pursuit of approval that was never going to come. 5 years of watching my husband choose his mother's happiness over mine time and again. In that moment, I made a decision. I would not accept this treatment any longer. I would not pretend this deliberate humiliation hadn't happened. Most importantly, I would not allow them to see me broken by their cruelty. Slowly, deliberately, I stood up. The movement was so unexpected in the middle of the ongoing conversations that it created a natural pause. All eyes turned to me, some curious, some wary, and Margaret's distinctly annoyed at the interruption. "I want to thank everyone for coming to our home today." I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "It's been illuminating to experience the Harrison family Christmas tradition so intimately." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing something in my tone that put her on alert. "I've spent 5 years trying to become part of this family," I continued. "I've learnt your recipes, studied your traditions, listened to your stories, and done everything possible to show respect for the Harrison way of doing things." The room had gone completely silent now. James was looking at me with alarm, clearly sensing this wasn't going to be the gracious hostess speech he expected. Today has made it abundantly clear that these efforts were never going to be enough. The coordinated decision to exclude me from the gift exchange wasn't an oversight or a misunderstanding. It was a message delivered with surgical precision. "Lillian," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp, "this is hardly the time or place for such dramatics. Perhaps you're overreacting to a simple oversight." "It wasn't an oversight when you told James's cousin not to bring anything for me. I overheard you on the phone last week," I said calmly. "It wasn't an oversight when you instructed Abigail to follow the family's lead regarding gifts. And it certainly wasn't an oversight when you rearranged the seating to place me as far from James as possible, or when you took credit for every dish I prepared, or when you systematically replaced every decoration I had chosen." James stood now too. "Lillian, maybe we should discuss this later," he said. His expression caught between embarrassment and confusion. "No, James, we've had 5 years of later, and nothing has changed." I turned back to address the room. "I don't expect gifts. What hurts isn't the absence of presents. It's the deliberate, coordinated effort to make me feel unwelcome in my own home, at my own dinner table, beside my own husband. I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out a small envelope I had nearly forgotten about. The final gift I had prepared but hadn't put under the tree, unsure if it would be appreciated. I have one last gift to share, I said, opening the envelope and removing a small photo album. I made this to document all the ways I've tried to become part of this family. I began turning pages slowly so everyone could see. There were photos of me learning to make Margaret's famous cranberry sauce, pictures of James and me at family events where I stood slightly apart from the group images of gifts I had given in previous years that now sat unused in closets or had been accidentally broken. The final pages showed our home before and after Margaret's adjustments with careful notes about each change. This isn't about presents, I said, closing the album. It's about respect. It's about acknowledging that after 5 years, I am not just James's accessory or a temporary inconvenience until he comes to his senses. I am his wife, and I deserve to be treated with basic courtesy. The silence in the room was absolute. Margaret's face had gone rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. Abigail looked uncomfortable for the first time I could remember. Thomas was studiously examining his Scotch glass. Several of the cousins and family friends were exchanging awkward glances, clearly wishing they were elsewhere. William was the only one who met my eyes directly. In his expression, I saw something that looked remarkably like respect. I won't be made to feel like an outsider in my own home anymore, I concluded. Either we find a way to interact with genuine respect, or we need to reconsider how these family gatherings will work in the future. Without waiting for a response, I placed the album on the coffee table and walked out of the room, head held high, heart pounding, but spirit unbroken for the first time in years. The immediate aftermath of my speech was a mixture of shocked silence and awkward attempts to resume normal conversation. As I stood in our bedroom taking deep breaths and coming to terms with what I had just done, I could hear Margaret's voice rising in the living room, attempting to salvage the evening. Well, that was certainly unexpected. She was saying, her tone suggesting she was addressing an unseemly but ultimately insignificant disruption. I suppose the holidays can be stressful for some people. Now, who would like more eggnog? But the damage was done. The carefully maintained facade of Harrison family harmony had been cracked and the reactions were divided. Through the partially open door, I could hear snippets of conversation. Some family members were rallying behind Margaret, murmuring about overreaction and making a scene. Others seemed uncomfortable, their responses shorter, less certain. William's voice carried clearly as he said, "Margaret, you know she wasn't wrong," before footsteps indicated he had moved away from the group. James found me about 20 minutes later. He entered our bedroom with the hesitant air of someone approaching an unexploded device. His expression was a complex mixture of embarrassment, confusion, and the beginning traces of something that might have been understanding. "Lil," he began, closing the door behind him. I've never seen you speak to Mum that way." "I've never spoken to anyone that way," I replied, sitting on the edge of our bed. "But after 5 years, it needed to be said. Couldn't you have waited until everyone was gone? Mum is really upset." Again, the fact that his first concern was for his mother's feelings rather than mine ignited a fresh spark of anger. "Your mother deliberately coordinated with your entire family to exclude and humiliate me in our home on Christmas, and your concern is that I've upset her." James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he always made when feeling cornered. "That's not what I meant. Couldn't this have been handled privately? Like all the other times I've tried to talk to you about how your family treats me, all the conversations that ended with you assuring me, Mom just needs time, or that's just how they are. No, James, this couldn't be handled privately because it wasn't a private humiliation. It was orchestrated and witnessed by your entire family. The tension between us was palpable. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, I wasn't backing down or accepting his rationalization of his family's behavior. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we had never properly addressed. "I can't do this anymore," I finally said. "I can't keep trying to earn approval from people who have no intention of ever giving it. And I can't stay in a marriage where my husband won't stand beside me when his family treats me like I'm invisible." That got his attention. James's head snapped up, genuine alarm in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need you to decide what matters more, your mother's approval or our marriage, because I won't spend another 5 years feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own life." We talked for over an hour, really talked without the careful avoidance of difficult topics that had characterized so many of our previous discussions about his family. I explained how each slight, each exclusion, each time he failed to notice or intervene had chipped away at not just my relationship with his family, but my trust in him. James, for his part, tried to help me understand the complex dynamics of growing up with Margaret as a mother, how her approval had always been conditional, how standing against her simply wasn't done in their family. We didn't resolve everything, but for the first time I felt he was truly hearing me. When we finally returned to the living room, most of the extended family had made excuses to leave early. Only the core group remained: Margaret and William Thomas and Sophia with their children and Abigail. "We've decided to call it a night," I announced, standing beside James, who looked uncomfortable but didn't contradict me. "Thank you all for coming, but I think we could all use some rest." Margaret looked as if she wanted to argue, but William stood up first. "Of course. It's been a long day. Thank you for hosting Lillian." The emphasis he placed on acknowledging me as the host was subtle but unmistakable. The process of gathering coats and leftover food containers was tense but mercifully brief. As they prepared to leave, I excused myself to check on something in the kitchen, unwilling to endure Margaret's cold-cheeked air-kiss goodbye. Through the kitchen door, I heard her final comment to James. "I hope you'll come by tomorrow, darling. We need to discuss certain things." "I'll call you Mom," was all James said, neither a commitment nor a refusal. The drive home for everyone else was no doubt filled with dissection of the evening's incident. Our home, once emptied of guests, felt both relieved of a great weight and heavy with unspoken tensions. James and I moved around each other carefully, cleaning up in near silence. Only when we were getting ready for bed did I remember the small package William had given me earlier. I retrieved it from the pocket of my dress and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was an antique silver bookmark with an inscription, "To thine own self be true, Cain." With it was a small note in William's precise handwriting: "Lillian, sometimes the strongest thing we can do is stand our ground. You have more allies than you know. William." That night, James slept on his side of the bed, more distance between us than usual. I lay awake long after his breathing had evened out, wondering if I had just irreparably damaged our marriage or taken the first step toward healing it. The days following Christmas were tense. James was initially defensive, caught between loyalty to his mother and recognition of the validity of my feelings. Margaret called multiple times, but James, in a surprising show of backbone, told her we needed some space to work through things as a couple first. A week after Christmas, James came home from work with a strange expression. He had spoken with his cousin Michael, who confirmed that Margaret had indeed called family members to instruct them not to bring gifts for me. Michael had felt uncomfortable with the request, but hadn't known how to refuse Margaret. "She told people I was handling your gifts," James said, the disbelief evident in his voice. "She lied to them and to me. When I called to ask her about it directly, she tried to tell me it was a misunderstanding." That conversation became the first of many as James began reaching out to family members individually, uncovering a pattern of Margaret's interference that went far beyond Christmas gifts. She had been systematically undermining me for years, correcting my contributions to family events, speaking negatively about me when I wasn't present, and subtly reinforcing the idea that I was temporary, not a true Harrison. The revelations hit James hard. The mother he had always defended, always made excuses for, had been deliberately driving a wedge between him and his wife. It forced him to confront not just her behavior toward me, but the unhealthy family dynamics he had normalized throughout his life. "I don't know who I'm more angry with," he confessed one night as we sat at our kitchen table, mugs of tea growing cold between us. "My mother for doing this, or myself for not seeing it for so long. It's hard to see clearly from inside a family system," I said, reaching for his hand across the table. "You grew up believing this was normal." Our conversations evolved into discussions about boundaries, what we would and wouldn't accept moving forward, not just from Margaret, but from his entire family. I made it clear that while I was willing to work on our relationship, I needed James to prioritize our marriage over his mother's demands. "I can't be the only one fighting for us," I told him. "Either we're partners in this, or we need to reconsider whether this marriage can work." It was an ultimatum, but a necessary one. James needed to understand that the status quo wasn't an option anymore. To his credit, once he began to see the pattern of manipulation, he became increasingly committed to changing it. Margaret predictably did not accept these changes gracefully. When James didn't appear at her home the day after Christmas, as she had expected, she showed up at our door unannounced. I was at work, so James faced her alone, perhaps the first time he had ever truly stood against her. According to James, she cycled through every manipulation technique in her arsenal tears about her ungrateful son, accusations about me, turning you against your family, guilt about after all I've sacrificed for you, and finally cold anger when none of these approaches worked. I told her that I love her, but that I won't allow her to treat you disrespectfully anymore, James said. I said that if she wants to be part of our lives, she needs to acknowledge what she did and make a genuine effort to change. Margaret left in a fury, and the weeks that followed were difficult. She attempted end runs around James by calling me directly at work, sending flying monkeys in the form of Abigail and Thomas to reason with us, and even enlisting William to mediate. Though to her frustration, William seemed to understand our position better than she expected. The process of healing began slowly, both within our marriage and in our relationship with James's family. James and I started seeing a marriage counselor who specialized in family boundary issues. Those sessions were often painful but necessary, helping James recognize the unhealthy patterns he had been raised to accept and giving me tools to express my needs without shutting down or exploding after years of suppressed hurt. The thing about boundaries, our counselor explained, is that they're not about controlling others. They're about what you will accept in your life. You can't make Margaret respect you, Lillian, but you can decide not to subject yourself to disrespect. James took those words to heart. He began setting clear expectations with his family about how I was to be treated, and more importantly, he followed through with consequences when those expectations weren't met. The first time he ended a phone call with his mother when she began criticizing me was a turning point. It showed both of us that he was truly committed to change. Some family members reached out individually in the months that followed. William was the first inviting us to lunch without Margaret. Over soup and sandwiches at a quiet restaurant, he apologized for not speaking up sooner. Margaret has always been forceful, he said, choosing his words carefully. I found it easier to keep the peace than to challenge her. But watching how she treated you at Christmas and seeing you stand up for yourself made me realize I've been complicit by staying silent. Theo, his honesty was refreshing, and it opened the door to a genuine relationship between us for the first time. William began calling occasionally just to chat, something that would have been unimaginable before. James's cousin Michael and his wife invited us over for dinner, a simple gesture that meant more than they probably realized. We always thought it was weird how Aunt Margaret treated you, Michael's wife confided. But no one wanted to be the one to rock the boat. Even Abigail surprised us. 6 months after the Christmas incident, she asked if we could meet for coffee. Alone at a cafe table, her usual polish slightly dimmed, she admitted that she had participated in Margaret's exclusion campaign, partly out of habit and partly out of her own insecurities. Mum has always pitted us against each other, she said, turning her coffee cup in slow circles. If someone was in favour, someone else had to be out of favour. I was afraid that if I didn't go along with her treatment of you, I'd be the next target. She looked up, her expression more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. It wasn't right, and I'm sorry. Thomas remained distant, too firmly entrenched in his position as the golden child to risk his status. But his wife Sophia sent a birthday card with a brief note that acknowledged the Christmas incident obliquely. Family dynamics are complicated, but kindness shouldn't be. Happy birthday, Lillian. These small gestures of reconciliation were healing, but the most significant changes happened within our marriage. James began to see his family with clearer eyes, recognizing patterns of control and manipulation that had shaped his entire life. As he established healthier boundaries with them, he also became more confident in our relationship, more willing to prioritize our needs as a couple over his family's expectations. When the next holiday season approached, we made a joint decision to spend Thanksgiving with my family instead of the Harrisons. It was the first time in our marriage that we had missed a Harrison holiday gathering, and Margaret's reaction was predictably dramatic. Tearful phone calls, guilt-laden messages, and finally a coldly formal email acknowledging our decision while making it clear she considered it a betrayal. Are you okay? I asked James after he read her email, watching his face carefully for signs of regret. Actually, yes, he said, and the surprise in his voice was genuine. A year ago, this would have torn me apart. Now it just feels like her problem, not mine. He reached for my hand. I'm looking forward to a drama-free holiday with your family. That Thanksgiving was a revelation for James. A holiday centered on gratitude and connection rather than performance and hierarchy. My parents welcomed him warmly as they always had, but he seemed to appreciate their genuine affection in a new way. "Is it always this relaxed at your family gatherings, though?" he asked as we helped with dishes afterward, and the wistfulness in his question broke my heart a little. By the time Christmas approached, Margaret had shifted tactics. Realizing that her usual methods weren't working, she extended an olive branch of sorts. An invitation to Christmas dinner with a note that said simply, "Things will be different this year. Please come." After much discussion, James and I decided to accept, but with conditions. We would attend for dinner, only not the full day. We would bring a dish to share, but wouldn't take over hosting responsibilities. And most importantly, we would leave immediately if there was any repeat of last year's deliberately exclusionary behaviour. "Are you sure about this?" James asked the night before as we wrapped the simple gifts we had brought for his family. "We can still change our minds." "I'm sure," I said, and I meant it. "This isn't about punishing your mother or holding a grudge. It's about seeing if real change is possible." Margaret's house was decorated with its usual impeccable taste when we arrived on Christmas Day. The tension was palpable as we entered, but Margaret greeted me with a stiff but polite hug, a far cry from her usual air kiss. William's welcome was warmer, and he whispered, "Glad you came," as he took our coats. Dinner was a restrained affair compared to previous gatherings. Margaret clearly making an effort to include me in conversations, though it sometimes felt forced. There were awkward moments, a few of Margaret's reflexive corrections quickly caught and amended, and an uncomfortable silence when someone mentioned last Christmas. But overall, it was a vast improvement. When it came time for gift exchange, I braced myself internally, unsure what to expect, despite Margaret's assurances of change. To my surprise, there were several packages with my name on them. Nothing extravagant, but thoughtful items that suggested someone had actually considered what I might like a cookbook from a chef I had mentioned. Admiring a scarf in colours I often wore, a gift card to my favourite bookstore. Margaret's gift to me was particularly telling, a silver photo frame containing a formal portrait of James and me from a charity event earlier that year. It wasn't a declaration of love or a complete transformation, but it was an acknowledgement of my place in James's life, and by extension, in the family. As we drove home that night, James reached over to take my hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not giving up, on me, on us, even on my mother, when you had every reason to." He squeezed my fingers gently. "It's still complicated, and Mom is still Mom, but it's better, because of you. The road ahead would still have its challenges." Margaret hadn't fundamentally changed her controlling nature, and there would be more boundary tests and difficult conversations. But something significant had shifted, not just in how the Harrison family treated me, but in how James and I functioned as a team. I thought about William's gift from the previous Christmas, the silver bookmark with its inscription, "To thine own self be true." By standing up for myself that night, I had changed more than just one difficult family gathering. I had changed the course of my marriage and my place within this complex family dynamic. That Christmas night had been painful, humiliating, and frightening, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes the most important gifts aren't wrapped in pretty paper or tied with perfect bows. Sometimes they come in moments of courage, in difficult truths spoken aloud, and in the slow, imperfect work of building genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than performative harmony. As we pulled into our driveway, our home warm and welcoming with the simple decorations we had chosen together, I realized that the empty-handed moment last Christmas had paradoxically given me something invaluable, the strength to define my own worth rather than allowing others to determine it for me. And that was a gift I would treasure always. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in a family situation? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. Whether you're dealing with difficult in-laws or trying to establish boundaries, remember that you deserve respect. If my story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stand in your truth.